Good morning, everybody. We are here today for the third session of our class on the Reformation. We're being led by Dr. Kenneth Sawyer, who's the professor at McCormick Theological Seminary. We've had him many times here before, and we certainly anticipate having him many times again. Before we start, we do have people on Zoom. So if you have a question, please wait till you get the microphone. We will be passing it out because they will not be able to hear you on Zoom if you don't have a microphone. So thank you very much for that, and we will be starting shortly. Thank you.
When you say shortly, do you mean now? All right. Thank you, Sam. You know, I saw an article this week, Apocalypse Eventually. That's a treatment of apocalypticism in world history, and those who would accelerate it and those who would delay it. So let's side with the accelerators just for our time here. Thank you, Sam, for that nice introduction. Thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you for 3 weeks of being able to be here with y'all on this remarkable floor. I mean, it is a wonderful floor, isn't it? Thank you for all the technical assistance that you have made this possible. I so appreciate being a part of this congregation's commitments lived out and embodied in a robust continuing education or adult education format. So in addition to with what y'all are doing with the kids, love the baptisms today, met Hannah, the baby, in the hallway. And I think that our understanding of the blessing of the children should be reversed, because I felt blessed by that baby, just being able to be close to that baby. Anyway, today is our third week together, and we just need to recognize as well that when we introduce so dynamic a term as Reformations, even if introduced inadequately, or even if mentioned without a lilt in the voice or a assist from a cup of coffee, it's a continuing and dynamic reality. Reformation could be considered mostly as a verb, right? That Reformation happens, church happens, sacrament happens, baptism happens. It's something which is dynamic. However one understands it. Luther understood the church or the sacraments to be the combination of the people of God with the proclaimed word of God. That's what localizes Christ in the sacrament. That's interesting. Zwingli, his counterpart, contemporary, one of the reformers of Zurich, and we're going to be focusing a little bit on him today. He understood the sacrament in terms of Christ's absence. Wow. Where Luther talked about the real presence, Zwingli spoke of the real absence. And that the depth of commemoration, do this in remembrance of me, did not depend on the charism of the priest or the beauty of the sanctuary, but rather on the nature and character and compelling reality of God's presence. Right. So we begin today with a nice image. This is from William Tyndale's New Testament from 1526. He was an Englishman, reformer. He ended up in Wittenberg. He spent time with by that time, by the 20s, Wittenberg had become a center for publishing and for publishing pamphlets mostly. Most of the Bibles were published in other places in Germany. But this is an English translation, right? The Gospel of St. John, the first chapter. It's on the front of the handout. In the beginning was that Word. So that Word was with God, and God was that Word. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by it, and without it was made no thing that made was. Right? Tyndale is really at the center of the English Reformation story. It is Tyndale's translation, and incidentally, you'll note it's not divided into verses, right? That's an innovation from the middle of the century, that Tyndale's translation is joined with other translations that were made legal by Thomas Cromwell in England, and then they become the substantial foundation upon which other translations into English are based, including the Geneva Bible, the Bible of the Puritans, and then about 40% of that translation finds its way into what becomes the authorized version, the King James Version. So that's its own story, the story of the formation of the canon and then the transmission of the text as well. You will remember from our first 2 weeks this collage of reformers. We've mostly focused on Erasmus and the humanist Reformation, the humanist reform agenda, and the ways in which Erasmus combined the renewal perspective of the Devotio Moderna with the Renaissance project of reclamation, of reclaiming the resources and richness of the ancient world. We also, last week, spoke a lot about Martin Luther. Martin Luther's insight that he couldn't pray enough, he couldn't fast enough, he couldn't confess enough, he couldn't empty himself of enough of himself to render himself acceptable to God. That was his view. That was his scruple. That was his burden. And I know that some of you have been in a similar situation at different times in your life, or you know people and have loved people who are convinced one way, for whatever reason, that God's grace is not for them. This was Luther's problem. His confessor, Johann von Staupitz, and others sent him to the scriptures and sent him to UW, University of Wittenberg, to lecture on Galatians, on Romans, and on the Psalms, and to read the German mystics. And so his insight upended his understanding of God, upended his understanding of the remedies available to him through the sacramental system of the medieval church, and unlocked for him an understanding of God's profligate love. I like this image from the sermon today about the garden and about the parables of the sower. And if we concentrate on the seeds, then that's one centering component of understanding some parts of that parable. If we concentrate on the profligate love of the sower, we may get some indication of the depiction of God's profligate love for the world, God's profligate love for individuals, God's profligate love. Not God as angry judge, but rather God as the profligate lover, the one who provides, the one who sustains, the one who brings us from places we had not places we've chosen and brings us to places we had not expected to be. I mean, this connects us then back with Paul, certainly, but with Augustine, with the early church experiences of God's loving provision and God's hope for creation as well. Luther's transformative insight runs through his theological project, as we were looking at last week. Later in life, he lives a long life because he's protected by his prince, the Elector of Saxony, one of the 7 votes for the Holy Roman Emperor. He dies in his bed. He dies in a bed after a long life. Over the course of his long life, he also showed some of his shadow fears, too, that stayed with him throughout his life, to recognize the ways in which he's not a perfect person. His hope for the conversion of the Turks, his hope for the conversion of Jews, his ignorance of individual Jews, his ignorance of individual Turks. He had never met a Muslim. He never met a Jew. He shared in the bias and prejudice and Christian contempt for Judaism that runs back into the early church period. And so we need to acknowledge the anti-Semitism of Martin Luther, not to beat up on him, but to recognize his limitations of insight, but then also to say, in the Lutheran traditions, there has been good reason to explain their troubled conscience and their motivations for, in the contemporary world, their leadership in dialogue with various Jewish groups and traditions, and their attentiveness to the cost of their confession. Right? So this week, for example, at the Lutheran School of Theology, there's going to be a liturgy of remembrance for Kristallnacht. And the Lutheran World Federation is really expressing its leadership in its continuing dialogue with Judaism, more generally defined, but then specific groups in dialogue with the Lutheran Federation. So history ought not to make him perfect, he wasn't, but rather to live into the ambiguities of the actual historical record as well. Right. We also talked about the era as an era of martyrs, the killing of William Tyndale in 1536, and to pay attention then to the power of the word and the easing of obliteration, really, of traditional gender roles for a short period of time, and then the reassertion of traditional gender roles. So Argula von Grumbach here is depicted in conversation with Johannes Eck, John of the Corner, at the University of Ingolstadt. And of course, Ignatius Loyola, born in 1491, dies in 1556, the poster boy of a kind of renewal and reform that crystallizes within and grows organically within Roman Catholicism, and then also focuses on opposing the agendas of the Protestants, right? So at the Council of Trent from 1547 to 1563, there is an articulated response to the proposals and programs of Luther, and we'll see also Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli and the Swiss reformers, and a point-by-point reaffirmation of the traditional Roman Catholic medieval sensibilities concerning church, performance of faith, doctrine of the sacraments, doctrine of the church. So when the Council of Trent ends in 1563, Calvin dies 1564, right? At the Council of Trent, the church is really, in some ways, imaged as a bulwark, as a fortress, and the walls go up. And within Roman Catholicism, those walls stayed up until our lifetimes, until the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s, 62 to 65. The Roman Catholic Church is still uncertain what all to make of the remarkable work of that Second Ecumenical Vatican Council in the early 60s. And so you may, in conversation with your Roman Catholic friends, or as you reflect on your own upbringing. If those of you who were raised as Roman Catholics, you may say, well, it's a mixed story. There are various narratives that are going on, in part because of the efforts at Trent in the 1540s and 50s into the 60s to stand firm, to build the walls, and to establish the truth as a permanent gift of God to the people of God. Wow. So we're going to talk about some contemporaries here. Remember that there are various movements of renewal and reform: the reform of the Christian humanists, the reform of agenda of Luther, of the radical reformers, of the disturbingly ambiguously titled Reformed Christians. That's who we're going to focus on right now. In the Swiss cantons, a group of reformers contemporary with Luther, but most of them not rooted in the monastic experience that he had as his own formation, but rather Christian humanist traditions. Back to the sources, study the New Testament in Greek, focus on the renewal by way of the Philosophia Christi. The cities like Basel and Bern, and especially Zurich, are at the forefront of that confederation of reform groups. Maybe confederation is not the right word. I mean, that's the political word to describe the ways in which the cantons were drawn together to form what becomes Switzerland. But maybe archipelago might be better, right? That each of these city-states reforms itself and the territories that it's responsible for. I would like to use that image of archipelago as well to describe the Presbyterian Book of Confessions, because each of these confessions speaks to the way, a depiction of reform in the particular geographic area where that reform took place. So when you pick up the Book of Confessions, you'll find some documents from the 60s, the 1560s, right? And then you'll skip a long period of time, you'll find something from the 1640s, the Westminster Confession, and then something from the Barmen resistance to Hitler, and then the Confession of 1967. These are just like, it's an archipelago of reform statements. And it underlines the fact that if you want to know about Lutheranism, study Luther. And you can get most of what you need to know from studying his life, his conflicts, his insights, his blind spots. You might throw in a dash of Melanchthon or maybe a pinch of Bugenhagen, but it's really his colleagues. But it's really Luther that you will need to stay close to. With the Reformed tradition, what becomes, the Reformed tradition, which is the dominant voice, the predominant voices of the American colonial story, Pilgrims and Puritans and Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Congregationalists. To understand Reformed Reformation theology, you can't just study one person. You can't just study Zwingli, as wonderful as he is. You can't just study Calvin, here he is, right? Because this is a tradition which is more like a chorus of voices, not a soloist, but a chorus of voices that blend together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not so much, but a chorus of voices. Zwingli is a good example. He was, after he finished his schooling, his family thought a great job for him would be a parish priest. So they bought a pastorate for him. If you're putting together your Christmas list, that would be a nice thing. Like endowing a professorship or giving somebody a scholarship to go study somewhere. You could purchase a pastoral office. He understood himself to be a good Erasmian humanist. He studied the lute in the daytime and memorized the Greek New Testament at midday, and I'm not sure what he did in the evenings, but who cares with that day, right? Anyway, he was appointed to be the priest at a pilgrimage site. And then he was called to the big job in Zurich as the people's priest at the Grossmünster. Some of you have been there. The main cathedral, right, in the older section of town. As soon as he got there, the plague broke out in Zurich, and 20% of the population was killed. That's quite a lesson, right? His own understanding of God's providence was blown up. His own study of the New Testament was tied to, linked to, embedded in, inseparable from his understanding of the powerlessness of the self before a sovereign God, before God's sovereign love, but God's sovereignty, right? He begins to teach and preach as the people's priest in Zurich. He's also given a seat on the city council. Right, I mentioned this last week. When Luther heard this, he said, "Bad move. This is not going to end well." For Luther, two kingdoms. I preach, the prince rules, all God's people are taken care of in that way. Obedience is Luther's advice to those who do not have the training that he has. There's a slight elitism there within a tradition that is continually professing the priesthood of all believers. There's been a bit of a tension. If we understand the priesthood of all believers to be one of the effects of one of the consequences of the Reformations, we'd have to put it in the list of aspirations, right? It's one of those confessional truths after which we continually chase. We're still hierarchical, although we say we believe in the priesthood of all believers. Still, we will defer to the pastor, we'll defer to the elder, we'll defer in ways that may also relinquish our role as God's lay people too. And I say that as a layperson teaching in a seminary, right? All right. Ulrich Zwingli says the city council must be about the business of reforming the churches in Zurich. It convenes a series of public disputations, 1523, 1524. Representatives of the old era show up, but they forgot to bring their Bibles. Good. Zwingli is about the business of rooting the Reformation in the scriptures and in right reason. He's a kind of closet rationalist. I mean, there's something modern, so modern about his own composition and his public confession that we're still kind of chasing after. I was going to bring an article entitled Zwingli, Prophet of the Modern World. That's an interesting essay, but I thought, although it's true that I don't think that I should be the one with all the articles, I didn't want to bring too many for your packet because it might prevent you from driving your car out of the parking garage, right? Zwingli posits a series of theses, rather like the 95 Theses. He publishes the 67 Theses, in which he explains and roots the Reformation in the scriptures, in the points that Luther also had lifted up, of a critique of an understanding of the Mass as a sacrifice, a critique of an understanding of the category of merit being generated by the multiplication of participations and replications of the Mass, a critique of the dietary laws, a critique of priestly celibacy. I mean, maybe because there were so many children of priests, the critique of clerical celibacy was an easy sell, right? And as we recall, Erasmus was himself the child of a parish priest. Right. Zwingli then convenes these city council meetings that argue about the speed, the substance, the sequence, and the extent of renewal and reform within the canton and within the city proper. Which churches should discontinue the Roman Catholic Mass, and which ones should institute an evangelical Mass, an evangelical worship service. How is it that the people who are nuns, the people who are priests, how will they be taken care of within this new economy? What about all of the enticements and beauties that are found in the church? The statues, the stained glass, the vestments. Wow. Zwingli points out that those are often, in his experience and in the experience of the churches of Zurich, a distraction. Wow, it's kind of reaching back to Augustine. You know, in Augustine's Confessions, he says, Lord, I loved your creations, not knowing that you were the creator of the creations I loved. So I sought you in the creatures that you had made, and I mistook your creatures for you. Well, so also, Reformed sensibilities look at Catholic worship and look at Lutheran worship and say there's too many distractions here. The option then for Zwingli is to worship God in spirit and in truth. Take out the stained glass. A blank wall is preferable to an idol or a distraction. Wow. Why is it in your upbringing, in your youth, when you would go to a Presbyterian church, the walls were blank? But if you went to a Lutheran church, the smells and bells would remind you of the proximity to the liturgical practice of Catholicism. Now, this church is an exception because this church participated in the late 19th, early 20th century recovery efforts of the 19th century liturgical movements. Right. So John Timothy Stone, when leading the design team for the sanctuary, sought to bring back some of the guides and goads of an aesthetic less iconoclastic than Zwingli, and more reverential towards the beauty of the past. That's interesting. For Zwingli and the Reformed folk like Calvin and Martin Bucer and Catherine Zell, they were more moved by the beauty of the holiness of God than they were moved by the holiness of the beauty of God's creation. So they thought, common people, all of us, are tempted to worship the church, the vestments, the stained glass, the choir, all these things that are beautiful things. And so instead, Zwingli says, we will seek to worship God in spirit and in truth. Wow, it's somewhat daunting. It is, especially in our own media-soaked era, I would say, well, what is the best way of finding a way in an image-rich, image-soaked world? Is it to unplug and to reclaim the interpersonal, to reclaim the face-to-face, to reclaim the face-to-text? Or should we find God mediated by a digital screen? Right? I'll leave that for some other topic, for some other day. Zwingli is quickly confronted by folk who agree with him, but who accuse him of being too timid. Folk who accuse him of not believing what he said. These folks have been gathered together by the historians as the radical reformers. They dissent from this reliance on the magistrates, the magisterial reform, and You know them, right? The Anabaptists, the spiritualists, the evangelical rationalists, and the revolutionaries. The Anabaptists, the word means to baptize again. They say, well, we weren't really baptized as babies. That wasn't a baptism. That was just a sprinkling. That was just a dose of cold water, right? So believer's baptism, right? That's what these Anabaptists speak of. And there are different groups, right? The Swiss Brethren, who opposed Zwingli, are saying, we will not make the compromises that you and the other magistrates are so comfortable making. We will not accept the compromises that are really tied all the way back to the 4th century, the time of Constantine, that has rendered Christendom what you've made it. To be baptized is to become a citizen. They say, no, we're going to break that link. We will baptize believers when they are grown up, since there's no mention of Jesus baptizing someone while they were asleep. And they say also, we will not fight in your armies. We will not pay your taxes. We will not be citizens of your demonic kingdom. Whew. So they helped unite the rulers and magistrates of Zurich and the other cantons against them. And if you go to Zurich, you can see places in which, from which some of these Swiss brethren were exiled, tossed out, pushed out, jailed, and then whipped, and then sent out. Don't come back. They came back. Don't come back. Push them. The same thing happened in Boston with the early Quakers, right? Mary Dyer, among other martyrs to freedom of conscience. Eventually, some of these Anabaptists were executed by drowning. Painful chapter. Other groups, though, that are also Anabaptists, you know some of them. Menno Simon's group, the Mennonites. Jacob Hutter's group, the semi-communistic, socialist Hutterites. There's still Hutterites out in the far west. And the Amish, named for one of their reformers, Jacob Ammon. Still around. Came in on the train a few weeks ago. There's a group of Mennonites that came in from northern Indiana. Goshen College, of course. Radical pacifists and bad citizens, claiming, we will not fight your wars. We're busy fighting the war of the Lamb. Wow. Dirk Willems was imprisoned because of his confession. And somehow, when he was being transported, he escaped. He ran across a frozen river. The guard chasing him fell through. Here he is, falling. The guard who was chasing him. And in good conscience, he stopped to help the man who was trying to catch him to put him to death. So he saved his captor, the one who was chasing him, who then captured him, put him back in jail, and then killed him. What is the cost of discipleship? What is the cost of confession? What is the cost, right? For Anabaptists, they would say it is to live, in so many ways they follow the imitatio tradition that Erasmus and the Imitation of Christ had provided as well. But they're pretty hard to live with. Any of you who have a religious perfectionist in your family will know, right, that that's tough. So most of them are exiled. They become a wandering people, right? The Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites are driven from place to place, from kingdom to kingdom. Some end up in Russia, some end up in Ukraine, some end up in Canada, some end up in Pennsylvania and in Indiana and further west, some in Mexico. Yeah, so this continues then. And recently, though, Anabaptists have started to move into cities. So you may know some Mennonites, for example. There are many Mennonites who have now taken up city life. and are seeking to bring the Anabaptist tradition into an engagement with the modern world. So they're still around, Reformation roots. The spiritualists, including the troublesome dean of the faculty at the University of Wittenberg, tended to focus on the interior, the spiritual, the spirit rather than the letter of the scriptures, right? Luther found him intolerable. Luther said, Karlstadt has swallowed the Holy Spirit, feathers and all, right? Bodenstein eventually gave up his faculty post and became just a laborer, just brother Andreas. And when he had run out of money and run out of friends, he ended up, for Luther's sins, living in Luther's house. So Luther learned a few things from him. Caspar Schwenkfeld, those of you from central Pennsylvania may know the Schwenkfeldians. Rusty Schweikert, who was one of the cabinet members for Ronald Reagan, was a Schwenkfeldian. They said that the sacraments are so corrupt, we hate each other so much, we need to become sufficiently disciplined that we love each other before we can reinstitute the practice of the sacraments. And so for 150 years, the Schwenkfeldians did not practice the Lord's Supper. Other spiritualists, there are many folks who would say that this is where the Quakers originate, that they emerged in a different place in the family tree of the Reformations, but they share an affinity of spirit with the spiritualists. The evangelical rationalists, out of which emerged the anti-Trinitarians and the modern-day Unitarian movement, are rooted here. And the revolutionaries. Here is a site of the little Westphalian town of Munster, which I learned Munster, Indiana is not named for this Munster. It's some other Munster, right? Virtually all of these groups are blamed for the excesses of this revolution that broke out in Munster. When the city was taken over by a group of enthusiasts who declared it to be the New Jerusalem, maybe the New Schaumburg, right? The New Schaumburg, right? So the New Jerusalem with Mosaic law, polygamy, radical egalitarianism, no pastors, no priests, just gospel grace. Oh, and plague and hunger and anarchy, right? So eventually, Catholics and Protestants cooperated in trying to bring order back to the city of Munster. One of your readings is a letter from John Calvin to the King of France, Francis I, in which he describes some of his motivations for writing his little textbook, The Institutes, which at that time was just about 200 pages, and then grew into a 1,200-page bloated carcass of guile. And in it he says, I knew people who were part of Munster. Menno Simon's brother was caught up at Munster and killed at Munster. People knew folk. I mean, it's like Waco and the Branch Davidians, right, from 25 years ago, of folk who took their end times prophecies and literalized them and applied them and declared themselves to be separate from history, separate from civics, separate from accountability, and said basically, you've got guns, bring it on. And the government, I think Clinton's earliest year as president, misread the situation dramatically, and a catastrophe ensued. The catastrophe of Munster is still a burden that many of the Anabaptist traditions bear up under. Here's a picture of the cathedral church with 3 cages that until the mid-19th century contained the bodies of 3 people who were part of that Munster rebellion. those of us who have not lived through war, those of us who have not lived during periods of profound economic dislocation or even of anarchy, have little understanding of the fear that those who have those experiences, the fear that they bring to an understanding of church and society. The reform programs associated not only with Zwingli, but then with his successors in other city-states, Swiss city-states, was fearful, dramatically fearful, and driven by the fear of anarchy. Right? Zwingli dies on the battlefield in 1531 at the Second Battle of Kappel. His colleague Johannes Oecolampadius dies also in 1531. There's a loss of leadership in this strand until folk like Martin Butzer, Matthew Zell, and his wife Catherine Zell emerge as leaders in the transition from the first to the second generation of reformers. They are informed as well by the remarkable fear of anarchy that this breaking up of this transnational reality of the medieval church, the late medieval church, offers as fear. The Peasants' Revolt of 1525, Luther is urging the local magistrates that while they're reforming the church, they need to kill as many peasants as they need to reestablish order. Wow. So when we're talking about the liberative motifs of the Reformation, we also need to acknowledge the ways in which aspects of the Reformation are also rearguard efforts to try to reassert sufficient control to protect against anarchy and to provide space for a regulated community. It sounds promising, but also dangerous too. But that's the tradition that this church stands in. It's a tradition of resistance, a tradition of resilience, a tradition of protest, less often than what it has often become. This tradition is a tradition of power and establishment. So again, we just need to regain a fuller understanding of the table of topics and traditions that we describe when talking about the Reformations, plural, of the 16th century. There are differences among these different groups, but that these reformers, Zwingli, Oecolampadius, Bullinger, the Zells, they don't agree about everything, but they do agree about some things, like the danger of idolatry. Idolatry as a central presenting problem. You find it throughout the Book of Confessions, that we would worship anyone, anything, anytime, rather than to worship the living God. Wow. We would rely on and derive comfort from the strength of our Department of Defense, sometimes called by foolish men the Department of War. Right. So we would place our trust in the Department of Defense rather than on relying on the sovereignty of God or the requirements that God speaks of in talking about justice and mercy within the same sentence. Confronting the danger of idolatry, the liberative promise of iconoclasm, the freedom felt by, expressed by, lived out in these reformed communities can also become its own impediment, right? So the Puritans, for example, 100 years later, are described by some as logo-centric and iconophobic, right? So we won't accept any pictorial depiction of God. Well, why not? Because it can become something which is distractive. Okay, because it might distract us into mistaking the image that we see for the reality that is beyond any and all descriptions. All right, that's an aesthetic which is a mature aesthetic. But why then are the churches bare? Why not regain some of the gifts of God for the people of God, including the performing arts, including the plastic arts, including the gifts of literature as well. Okay, so there's different centers of Reformed activity. Perhaps the most important one for a while after the death of Zwingli and before the emergence of Zwingli's successor, Ulrich Bullinger. You know him from the Book of Confessions. He's the author of the Second Helvetic Confession, a great text. But the city of Strasbourg is a city of refugees, a city that has the great blessing of a group of reformers: Martin Butzer, Wolfgang Capito, Matthew Zell, Catherine Zell, Jacob Sturm, and a young man who was chased out of his first job, John Calvin, in Geneva because he was bad at his job. He pushed too hard. He was a Christian humanist who was himself a refugee. The police raided his apartment in 1534 in the so-called Affair of the Placards, when overnight a placard, a big piece of parchment with a reform agenda, thousands were posted all over the city of Paris, including on the bedroom door of the king. The police are upset, the ICE of their times are upset, and they raid different apartments, including his. That's one of the reasons why we don't have that many documents from his early life. But we know he was a Christian reformer. We know he laid aside the offices that he had received benefits from. He had joined the reformers and had written a little book about the Stoic philosopher Seneca. Any Stoics in the room? That it wasn't a bestseller, but it shows his humanist cred. And then he wrote this little book, this little guidebook that followed the organization of Martin Luther's large catechism. Here we go. The 1536 edition of the Institutes has 6 chapters. And again, it's back in print. So again, I mentioned this before. It would make a great stocking stuffer. That's right. That's right. I realized that everyone is rushing the season, but when I was putting things in here, I thought, why are the Christmas ornaments already here? But anyway, 1536 edition of the Institutes. It's a handbook of piety. It follows Luther's small catechism. It shows him at his youthful hopefulness as a Christian humanist, devoted to reform and renewal as well. If you'd like to take a look at it, please. From this torso, he works for the next 30 years on his most famous work, the Institutes. He will publish it in French, then publish a Latin translation, then a new edition. 1542, he reworks the whole thing. Eventually, 1559, the last edition that he works on before his death in 1564, it has gone from 6 chapters to 80. It's gone from 200 pages to 1,200. It's really organized into 2 parts. The first part, talking about knowledge of God the Creator, and then books 2, 3, and 4, knowledge of God the Redeemer. So everyone says, oh, well, where's predestination? Well, predestination is buried all the way in the tail end of book 3. He says, we should teach predestination, but we shouldn't start with that. That's foolishness. He was a master teacher. Sequence was everything for him. And he said, you can't bear this information until you know God as your loving parent, until you know the Christian community in which you are baptized, by which you are nourished, by which you are encouraged, by which you are disciplined, by which you are educated. You can't cope with this good biblical teaching, which you should know about, until you you know the loving community which informs the conversation. That's such a good point. He was an educator. He talks about God and God's self, the nature of God, and then how we experience God. I think that, as a beginning teacher, I would say that we should begin the reading of the Institutes with Book 3, because our times tend to be experiential and less theocentric than anthrocentric. And so the way we experience and receive the grace of Christ, I think that's the place to start. That's one of the handouts that I have for you for today, is from this third book. And let's take a quick look at it. It begins with chapter 6, page 684, the life of the Christian human, the Christian man in his patriarchal times. I like on page 685, in which on page 685 he says, by nature, I love brevity. Right, and then he goes on for another 600 pages. But he talks about the ways in which the Christian life is a life in which we ought to center Christ rather than ourselves or our own experience. Basically, he says we need to get up out of ourselves so that we recognize and can begin to see and engage and honor the glories of creation, but also the challenges of humanity as well. He centers his discussion in his experience of the primacy of Christ, and that reorders his understanding of the place of the individual in society. Before the Reformation, the late medieval church said, it is useful for you to give the man who positions himself outside on the corner $1 on your way in, because that's part of the exchange of goods and services by which you enrich your own personal storehouse of merit. The Reformation traditions from Luther forward said, the fact that you have a man who positions himself outside your sanctuary, in his wheelchair, asking for alms, is an indictment of us, not of him, but of us. Luther issues a treatise entitled, That There Be No Beggars Among Us. It begins an era of the institution of and experimentation about community chests, community service, remedies that then render it more likely for those who are able to become productive members of society. So I think about this often as I walk to my school, and the number of people who must, like me, walk over the people who are living under the bridge on the way to this privileged community of the University of Chicago Lab School. How is it that our social policies lost sight of and lost grip of on this Reformation value, that we're all in this together, and that social services, social issues, social policy need to be part then of the conversation of the community of the faithful. Right, just an aside. I've given you a couple of essays, one by Randall Zachman. Some of you know him. He taught for many years at Notre Dame. This is a nice summary of contemporary scholarship concerning Calvin. And then I also gave you an essay by Louis Weeks on the Reformed tradition, leading us from the continent, the European continent, into the New World and into the colonial American context. I mean, by the time that the Puritans show up and the Puritan separatists, the Pilgrims, show up, the Reformation has already calcified in some areas, and its most lively and dynamic parts are lived out in dissenting movements, pietism, Puritanism, and also in missions movements. So how to get from then to now, this essay is a really good guide and can provide you with a few things to think about. So we've run out of time. But I'd just like to remind you of the Reformations, plural, of the distinct and diverse agendas of reform that are associated with the Christian humanists, embodied so well by Desiderius Erasmus. What we have that flows from the Reformations is rooted in the realities that we have approached in the last 3 days, but is routed through conscience, through City Hall, through exile communities, so that in the post-Reformation world, this unity of the medieval church is gone. And the political response is to say, unless you agree with the king, you need to leave this territory, right? So the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 divides the world between Protestants and Catholics. But that's not a big enough division, right? The catastrophe of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, culminates in the Treaty of Westphalia, which divides the world between Protestants, Catholics, and Reformed folk. I mean, Lutherans, Catholics, and Reformed folk. But that's not capacious enough, is it? Or precisionist enough, or effective. The internal dissent of Anabaptists or of folk who say, I'll stay in your jurisdiction, but I will not believe what you tell me I must believe. That is not until the middle of the 17th century that folk dare, risk, are audacious enough to suggest different ways of organizing the polity. And so because of a creditor's threat, a young man establishes Pennsylvania, William Penn, suggesting that everyone is welcome. Wow. The other colonies don't agree with that, but we'll see that this perfect babble of confusion, as the contemporaries defined it, Pennsylvania, issues a new agenda, new possibilities, and a recognition of the possibility that people who disagree about ultimate reality can still live together within a polity, within a state, within a community. So some of the challenges of the Reformation and post-Reformation world are still with us. The revival of what is sometimes called the New Apostolic Reformation needs some exposition and investigation, because it's kind of an amalgam of Neo-Calvinism and Pentecostalism. But again, that's for another sequence of talks.
I think you ought to do a course study and tell us how John Knox fits into all this. Because as I understand it, he was a student of John Calvin, and went down to Geneva and studied there. And of course, he's much more the father or grandfather of Presbyterianism, as is the church.
Sure.
The Church of Scotland. And I don't know how that fits into American Presbyterianism. I know the town in which I live, over just across the line in Indiana, that was originally mostly Calvinistic and Reformed churches. And they were Dutch truck farmers who founded South Holland and around the rim of the lake there.
Right. Well,
I can't even be buried, but the Calvinists in my town are so alienated from the Presbyterians, of which I was pastor for 25 years, that I couldn't even be buried in their cemetery, because they are still separate themselves very much from the John Knox reform.
yes. Well, in 65 years, when we will need to find a place for your burial site,
I know a lot of people who would agree with you and say the sooner the better.
No, 65 additional years. That this essay by Lewis Weeks talks about different Reformed groups, Calvinists, Huguenots, Scots-Irish, English Puritan Reformed folk, and how they form this American tapestry, and how each makes use of this American invention, the denomination, for institution formation, for evangelism, for publishing, and for the founding of congregations and of colleges. So, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.